A white woman's theft wrongly incriminates a black man, revealing deep prejudice. Greenfield was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, a town forgotten by the rush of modern life. Its streets were lined with neatly manicured lawns and quaint little shops, and its people moved to the rhythm of an era long past. Tucked among rolling hills, Greenfield was the embodiment of small-town America, where everyone knew your name and gossip flowed as freely as the autumn leaves that fluttered from the trees. For Claire Atwood, Greenfield was a last resort. She had come to the town with big dreams, but life hadn't gone as planned. A 23-year-old art student, Claire had imagined herself in New York or Paris, painting masterpieces and living a life of freedom and creativity. But her art had not sold, and her savings had dried up quicker than she had anticipated. She moved to Greenfield, hoping that the slow pace and low cost of living would give her time to regroup and find her next steps. Her reality was much grimmer than she had imagined. Rent was overdue, the bills were piling up, and she was barely scraping by with odd jobs that paid little more than minimum wage. She hated it, every part of it. Greenfield's charm had become suffocating, a constant reminder of everything she wasn't achieving. On that fateful autumn morning, Claire woke up with a familiar knot in her stomach. The pressure to survive was weighing heavily on her, as it had been for weeks. She dressed quickly, pulling on her favorite coat, a vintage wool piece she had picked up at a thrift store in better times. Her hands brushed over her favorite necklace, a dainty chain that now seemed like the last remnant of her old life. She had to get out of her small, cramped apartment, if only to breathe for a little while. As she walked through the streets, the town seemed to mock her with its simplicity. Claire's thoughts were consumed by her unpaid bills and the feeling of losing control over her life. Her rent was overdue, and her landlord had been less than sympathetic the last time they spoke. Every part of her screamed that she needed a solution, fast. Across town, Miles Parker was preparing for his own day, unaware that his life was about to intersect with Claire's in a way that would change everything. Miles was well known in Greenfield, not because he sought attention, but because of the kind of man he was. At 34, Miles had built a small but respected auto repair business from the ground up. He was proud of his work, proud of his steady clients, and proud of the reputation he had built for himself. He was quiet, focused, and kept to himself, a necessity, he felt, for a black man in a town where there were so few people who looked like him. Greenfield had been his home since he was born. His parents had moved there when he was a child, hoping to escape the more overt racism of larger cities. But even here, in this peaceful place, Miles felt the subtle prejudices that came with living in a predominantly white community. People liked him well enough. They respected his work. They called him one of the good ones. But there was always that invisible line. Miles had spent his life walking carefully around it, making sure never to cross it, never to give anyone a reason to look at him differently. As he got into his truck that morning, heading to Baxter's department store to pick up some new tools for the shop, he had no idea that this day, like so many before it, would follow a far different trajectory. Claire's feet carried her down Maple Street, her mind swirling with thoughts of what she was going to do next. She didn't have a plan. She was too far in debt to think clearly anymore. Rent was due again in just a week, and her bank account was almost empty. She had sold almost everything she could part with, but it still wasn't enough. Her steps faltered as she passed Baxter's department store, and without thinking, she walked in. She had no intention of buying anything. She couldn't afford it. Maybe she just wanted to feel normal, to look at things without feeling the crushing pressure of money. Inside, the store was warm and filled with the scent of wood polish and fresh produce. Mrs. Emerson, the elderly clerk who had been working at Baxter's for as long as anyone could remember, was behind the counter, her sharp eyes following the few customers who were browsing. Claire avoided her gaze, feeling a stab of guilt, though she wasn't sure why. She wandered through the aisles aimlessly, her thoughts a blur. Her fingers brushed over the fabrics of clothes she couldn't buy, her eyes drifting over household items she would never own. And then she saw it, a bracelet. It wasn't the fanciest piece of jewelry, but it was beautiful in its own understated way. A simple gold band, delicately engraved with a pattern that shimmered in the store's light. Claire felt a sudden, overwhelming desire to have it, It was a ridiculous thought. She couldn't even afford groceries, let alone jewelry. But something about the bracelet spoke to her. It was a symbol, perhaps, of the life she wanted, of the control she longed to regain. She stood in front of the display case, staring at it, her heart racing. She could never afford it, but what if she just took it? The thought hit her out of nowhere, shocking her with its audacity. She wasn't a thief. She had never stolen anything in her life, but something about the moment, about the desperation that had been building inside her for weeks, pushed her closer to the edge. Her mind raced, imagining how easy it would be. The store was nearly empty, and Mrs. Emerson wasn't paying attention. Claire swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she reached out and unlocked the case. With one quick motion, she slipped the bracelet into her coat pocket and turned to leave, her heart pounding in her ears. As she approached the door, her eyes darted around the store. She needed to get out before anyone noticed. She was almost there, her hand on the handle, when she bumped into someone. A man. "I'm sorry," the man said, stepping back to let her pass. Claire barely glanced at him, mumbling an apology before rushing out the door. She didn't know it yet, but that man was Miles Parker, and their brief encounter would change both of their lives forever. Miles had arrived at Baxter's shortly after Claire, unaware of the tension building inside the store. He walked past the jewelry counter without a second glance, heading straight for the hardware section. He needed a new set of wrenches for the shop, and Baxter's had just what he was looking for. As he browsed, Mrs. Emerson's eyes followed him, narrowing slightly. She had been watching Claire earlier, sensing something was off, but now her attention shifted to Miles. She didn't trust him. She never had. There was something about him, something about the way he moved, the way he kept to himself, that made her suspicious. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but in her mind, he didn't belong. Miles noticed Mrs. Emerson watching him, but he didn't pay it much mind. He was used to it. He had lived in Greenfield his whole life, and he had learned to navigate the subtle prejudices that came with being a black man in a predominantly white town. He kept his head down, never wanting to give anyone a reason to suspect him of anything. After picking out his tools, Miles made his way to the front counter. Mrs. Emerson rang him up with her usual frosty politeness, her eyes lingering on him as he paid and left. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face made it clear that she was watching him closely. Miles left the store, feeling the cool autumn air hit his face as he walked to his truck. But just as he was about to get in, two police cruisers pulled up beside him, their lights flashing. The moment the police arrived, Miles' stomach dropped. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew all too well how quickly things could spiral out of control in situations like this. He had seen it happen to others. He had heard the stories, and now it was happening to him. The officers approached him, their hands resting on their belts, their eyes hard. One of them, Officer Reynolds, was well known in Greenfield for his no-nonsense approach to policing. Miles had crossed paths with him a few times, and it had never been a pleasant experience. "Sir, we need to ask you some questions," Officer Reynolds said. His voice clipped. "What's this about?" Miles asked, keeping his voice calm. "There's been a report of a theft," the officer replied. "We're going to need you to come with us." Miles' heart sank. "A theft? I didn't steal anything. I just bought some tools." Officer Reynolds didn't seem interested in Miles' explanation. "We need you to empty your pockets." Miles hesitated. He knew he hadn't stolen anything, but the situation was escalating quickly. He didn't want to make it worse. Reluctantly, he emptied his pockets, his wallet, his keys, nothing else. But the officers weren't satisfied. They asked him to step aside while they checked his truck, searching it thoroughly, as if they expected to find something incriminating. Of course, they found nothing. Mrs. Emerson appeared in the doorway of Baxter's, her arms crossed, her expression stern. "He was acting suspicious," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saw him near the jewelry counter." Miles' blood ran cold. He hadn't been anywhere near the jewelry counter, but Mrs. Emerson's words carried weight in Greenfield. She was a trusted member of the community, and if she said he had been acting suspiciously, people would believe her. "I didn't take anything," Miles said, his voice steady but firm. "I was just here to buy tools. You can check the receipt." The officers didn't seem convinced. They glanced at Mrs. Emerson, whose disapproving glare didn't waver. It didn't matter that there was no evidence, no proof that Miles had done anything wrong. The accusation had been made, and that was enough. "We're going to need you to come down to the station with us," Officer Reynolds said finally. Miles wanted to argue, to protest, but he knew better. In situations like this, arguing only made things worse. So he nodded, his heart heavy, and allowed the officers to handcuff him and lead him to the back of the cruiser. As the doors closed behind him, Miles felt the weight of the moment settling in. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, arrested, accused, and humiliated, all because someone had decided he looked suspicious. The trial was scheduled quickly, and within days, Greenfield was buzzing with gossip. The story spread like wildfire, and by the time the trial began, nearly everyone in town had an opinion about Miles Parker. Some were shocked, insisting that Miles could never have stolen anything. "He's a good man," they said. "I've known him my whole life." But others weren't so sure. "You never really know someone," they whispered. "Maybe there's more to him than we thought." In the courtroom, Miles sat beside his lawyer, his face calm but his heart racing. He had spent his entire life trying to avoid situations like this, but now he was at the mercy of a system that didn't always care about the truth. His lawyer was doing everything possible to defend him, pointing out the lack of evidence, the fact that nothing had been found in his possession. But the prosecution leaned heavily on Mrs. Emerson's testimony. She was a respected member of the community, and her word carried weight. "She saw him near the jewelry counter," the prosecutor said, pacing in front of the jury. "She noticed him acting suspiciously. That's why she called the police." Miles felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. It didn't matter that he hadn't been near the jewelry counter. Mrs. Emerson had seen what she wanted to see, and now her testimony was being used to destroy his life. As the trial wore on, Miles's hope began to fade. He could see it in the faces of the jurors. They had already made up their minds. No matter what his lawyer said, the accusation alone was enough to cast doubt. And then, just as it seemed all hope was lost, the doors to the courtroom swung open. Claire Atwood stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands shaking. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she had the strength to go through with what she was about to do. But then her eyes met Miles, and she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. "I need to speak," Claire said, her voice trembling. The courtroom fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her legs feeling like lead beneath her. "I'm the one who stole the bracelet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Claire continued, her words spilling out in a rush. "Miles didn't do it. He wasn't even near the jewelry counter. I took it. I was desperate, and I made a terrible mistake." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the bracelet, placing it on the stand in front of her. The room was so silent that Claire could hear the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I never meant for this to happen. Miles didn't do anything wrong." For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of Claire's confession hung in the air like a dark cloud. Mrs. Emerson's face had gone pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. The prosecutor stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed. And Miles? Miles could hardly believe what he was hearing. The judge called for a brief recess, and after a few minutes of hurried discussion between the lawyers, the charges against Miles were dropped. Outside the courthouse, Miles stood in the crisp autumn air, free at last. But the experience had changed him in ways he hadn't yet processed. Though his name had been cleared, the suspicion from the town wouldn't disappear overnight. He had seen the way people had looked at him, the way their perceptions of him had shifted so easily. It was a reminder that, no matter how well he lived his life, he would always be walking a fine line. Claire approached him cautiously, her face still pale from the stress of the confession. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "I never meant for this to happen." Miles looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He could see the regret in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of what she had done. She had almost ruined his life, but in the end, she had come forward and told the truth. Everyone makes mistakes, Miles said quietly. What matters is what you do afterward. Claire nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I'll never be able to make this right, she said softly, but I'm going to try. Miles gave a small nod, but he didn't say anything more. He wasn't sure if he was ready to forgive her yet, but he knew he didn't want to carry the burden of anger and bitterness. He had been through enough. As Claire walked away, Miles stood alone for a moment, taking in the cool air and the sense of freedom that came with the truth finally being revealed. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to move forward, leaving behind the shadows of injustice that had once threatened to consume him. Greenfield returned to its usual pace in the weeks that followed, but the trial had left a mark on the town. People had been forced to confront their own biases, their own willingness to believe the worst without questioning the facts. Some began to reflect on how easily they had judged Miles, while others quietly pushed the memory of the trial to the back of their minds, eager to move on and return to the status quo. Claire, on the other hand, faced her own consequences. She was charged with theft and sentenced to community service, but the punishment was only part of her burden. The guilt of what she had done, of almost ruining an innocent man's life, weighed heavily on her. She spent her days working to rebuild her life, but she knew that some wounds could never fully heal. As for Miles, he continued to run his auto shop, slowly regaining the trust and respect of the town. The experience had shaken him, but it hadn't broken him. He knew that trust would take time to rebuild, but he was determined to reclaim his life on his own terms. The moral of the story is clear. Assumptions can be dangerous. Claire's silence allowed an innocent man to be blamed, and Miles's wrongful arrest highlighted the power of prejudice and the fragility of trust. But in the end, the truth came out, as it always does. Justice is not only about punishing the guilty, but about seeking the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. In a world where fear and bias can lead to devastating consequences, we must strive to listen, to question, and to act with integrity. Only through accountability and understanding can we begin to heal the divides that threaten to tear us apart.